Hey guys, this is James and welcome to Speculating with SPEL. This is the Society of Politics, Economics, and Law here at NC State, and in these videos we'll be diving into different political topics that are currently happening in our nation. Before we get into the video, don't forget to like and subscribe. All right, Dr. Lane, so I want to start us off. I know that you'll be speaking to us later with about the Supreme Court term. So, in one word, how would you describe the previous Supreme Court term?
Oh, one word. The previous term, I would say about as expected, which I guess is a phrase and not a word.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think there were a lot of surprises in this most recent term, like there were the previous term. Although I wouldn't say those were surprises, more so some important landmark decisions that were made. But I think this term was about to be expected, and I think a lot of the news that came out of this term were kind of things that were going on outside of the court, right? So that involved the justices and their personal lives that have been
Mm-hmm.
making headlines as of late.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's actually, my next question was, so I know I looked and you do research on how external factors will affect the Supreme Court. So one of the big ones is that Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas may have taken like vacations or other benefits from like a big time real estate guy. So what do you think about that and its effect on the Supreme Court?
Yeah, so I think the important thing about the Supreme Court, right, is that when we talk about it, we often talk about how the public perceives it and how the public views it as being legitimate or not, which is really important compared to other institutions like the president or Congress, because there is a direct electoral connection to those two institutions. Whereas the Supreme Court, as Alexander Hamilton famously wrote, and much more eloquently, they have neither the power of the purse nor the sword. So, what that means is that they rely on the other institutions to provide resources to carry out their decisions, right? Or implement their decisions and enforce them. And without the public support of the Supreme Court, right, the other institutions are going to be less likely to do that. And so, a lot of people have been questioning whether the Supreme Court is in this kind of legitimacy crisis right now, because of the way that they've been making decisions, but also these external things that have been going on, like Clarence Thomas being connected to these benefits. But he's not the only one, right? Chief Justice John Roberts, turns out his wife makes a ton of money by basically placing attorneys into really big named law firms. And she's like a legal headhunter, for lack of a better word. And definitely uses probably right her connections with John Roberts, and then Clarence Thomas's wife, Ginny Roberts, Ginny Thomas, is she is involved in a lot of policy initiatives and interest groups. And so, like, not unscathed. And then, I mean, if we go back even further, right, Brett Kavanaugh had a lot of credit card debt that came out when he was nominated to the Supreme Court. And all of a sudden, that credit card debt was paid off. He claims that his friends paid him back for Washington Nationals tickets, but who knows, right? So there's, Clarence Thomas isn't the only one. It comes from all of these other areas too. And so far, research and political science isn't totally clear on a direct connection between these, what we would call, I guess, political scandals, right? That oftentimes plague other institutions or members of other institutions, but how that's impacting how people view the court. I can tell you from some of my own research that I'm doing, where I ask people open-ended questions about the Supreme Court. They bring up this stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
How they are paid by political groups and things like that. So, although people don't have a lot of political knowledge about the Supreme Court, traditionally, because they're making the news for the wrong reasons, people are paying attention. And generally, that doesn't bode well for the court as an institution.
Hmm. Yeah, I think. And then, do you think the fact that people tend to think poorly of politicians because they may have outside benefits, such as like super PAC and other groups like that, do you think that kind of thought process will bleed into how people view the Supreme Court justices?
So I think for a really long time, right, the general political science understanding of how people viewed the Supreme Court was through this kind of to know the court is to love the court, right? So the more that you know about the court, the more you see them with their robes and with the bench and with the really pristine white building, right? All of these are what we view as like legitimizing symbols, right? That makes them different from the other branches of government, right? They've always distinguished themselves in that way. But with these relationships that are emerging, right, that is kind of drawing them closer in a way towards these other branches of government. And so, yeah, I think that's problematic for the court because, as I mentioned, like they need the people to view them as legitimate and at least accept them as an institution in order for their decisions to continue to be carried out. And I think that a lot of the um, I think, partisan nature through and polarization amongst the public by which they view the court's decisions, and then like these other things that have been happening. I think that is hurting the court's legitimacy or hurting the way that people view the court, which you can see if you just Google a Gallup or a Pew poll about the Supreme Court recently. So I'm not sure if I actually answered your question. I think I just started kind of rambling.
No, I think you did. I think you explained it that like people automatically bring their own polarization because obviously with like the presidential election coming up, people are divided from like who they want to vote for, and then they see the justices that may be voting for a ruling that they may not be supporting. So definitely, I think you did a fine job with that. And then I want to move on to another pretty important question. But what do you think about the current like democratic process of trying to expand the court to 13 justices from 9?
Yeah. So this would be an example of what we would call court curbing, right? This
Mm-hmm.
expanding the court would fall into this area of policy that would in some way weaken the power of the current justices, right? Going from 9 to 13 would make their votes less impactful, presumably. Um, that is a much easier thing to do, right? Expanding or shrinking even the number of justices on the bench. And it happened a lot through history at the beginning of the country. The court started at 6 justices. At one point, right after the Civil War, it went up to 10. Then it went back down to 9 with some movement in between. And we've stayed at 9 ever since. But that only requires a simple act of Congress to change the number of justices. So I think that is a feasible, I think, piece of court curbing legislation, whereas something like mandatory retirement age or something like, term limits, that's
Mm-hmm.
much more difficult because that, of course, requires a constitutional amendment, since it says in Article 3 that they will serve in good behavior, basically, they have lifetime appointments. The problem that I see with expanding the court is this kind of tit for tat that will happen. So, for example, when district court judges were not getting confirmed during George W. Bush's tenure, uh, we had this move towards what we call the nuclear option, right? So they changed the rules in the Senate from getting rid of the filibuster and cloture, and needing just a simple majority to confirm those district and then eventually circuit court judges under Obama in 2013. And then, prior to Neil Gorsuch's confirmation, the Senate finally went nuclear on Supreme Court nominations, meaning they only needed a simple majority. Therefore, filibuster was no longer an option in order to confirm them. So now, instead of seeing, these numbers like we saw with Antonin Scalia and Ruth Bader Ginsburg, where it's almost a unanimous decision, but for a couple of senators, we're basically seeing votes right down party lines to confirm Supreme Court justices. And so this was a tit for tat thing that happened under each president, right? And when they had power in the Senate in order to get their lower court nominees confirmed. And so what I think people are worried of and hesitant to make alterations to an institution like the Supreme Court is that we expand it now in order to presumably help the more liberal viewpoint, right? Because the Supreme Court is 6-3 conservative currently. And then later on down the line, there's nothing that would stop the Republicans eventually from expanding it in their favor should the balance of power switch.
Mm-hmm.
So that is what I think makes it, while it's possible, unlikely, because I think people are worried about kind of a snowball effect.
Mm-hmm. More like a precedent that if you change it for your views, we're going to change it for our views, and kind of have a big mess show up. Yeah. But I kind of want to wrap it up. So what is what is happening in the Supreme Court right now that you think every student should be aware of?
Oh, that's a great question. What is happening at the Supreme Court right now that every student should be aware of? Do you mean like a case or just like institutionally?
Any piece of news that you think is important that you think people don't know about?
So I think something important to keep an eye on is basically this idea of how the public is reacting to the court. Right now, we have a lot of people who are disheartened by their policy decisions, right? Because at the end of the day, whether you view the court as a legal or a political institution, by the way, they're a political institution, who simply justifies their decisions with legal precedent and case law, a lot of the American public is dissatisfied with the way that they are currently doing their job. And I think John Roberts, in particular, has been aware of this for a while. And we've seen him vote strategically in some cases to try to help ameliorate that, right? This kind of idea of trying to save the court's legitimacy. But I think something that, regardless of a student's viewpoints or beliefs, right? This idea of how far out of line can the court get with public opinion before it's hurt its legitimacy more permanently. So for the longest time, the Supreme Court was viewed more favorably, or the public had more confidence in the court than any other American institution except for the U.S. military. And it was by a significant amount, and that is no longer the case. More people are dissatisfied with the job that the court is doing than they are satisfied with the job that the court is doing. And it's questions of like, what is it going to take to try to get them back to where they were? And is that even possible in the current political climate, since Americans themselves are so polarized? So I think that is something to keep an eye on.
That's great. Thank you for that. So I think we're about to come up on the 15-minute mark. So
well,
if there's anything else you would think is important other than that,
well, the Supreme Court term starts on the first Monday in October. So they already have cases on their docket. And I would just say, keep an eye on the news of the important cases that they're deciding, because you may think that they don't relate to you, but I think that there are a lot more cases that are of significance that people don't realize, that impact them. And I would say, for example, a lot of my students in particular, are applying to law school this year. next year. And the Supreme Court basically threw out, current policy on law school admissions in this last term. And so it's kind of unclear like what's going to happen. A lot of law schools are unclear on how they are going to be admitting students, right,
Mhm.
with regard to their backgrounds, their qualifications, etc. So just the Supreme Court's super relevant to your life. And if you want to learn more, take PS 308.